Welcome back, Reg audience, and welcome to our latest Regcast. We're all about saving money today. We know from the surveys that you do for us that this remains near or at the top of the agenda. It never seems to go away, and yet, when people promise you that things will save money, somehow that never quite seems to happen either, does it? Well, we've got some practical plans for you today. If you're involved in virtualization, all of you are really, then we might be able to save you quite a bit of cash. I've just been going through the figures with the guys on the outside, and there's quite large numbers on this. So if it comes off, we have done you a huge favour. All we want is your thanks. So let's have a look why we are here today. Now, if you remember back a few years ago when we were doing these Regcasts, we were all about how virtualization was going to save cash. That was the first big thing we used to talk about with virtualization. And we kind of moved on from that, and it didn't really happen for you. But we've got a way that you can recover some of your costs. Give us 1 hour of your time and we will save you cash. Who's going to save the cash for you today? Well, we've got some people who will do it. So first of all, let me introduce on the far end of the table from Embotics, Colin Wright. Colin, welcome to the studio.
Thank you, Tim.
Now, tell me about Embotics. What's Embotics?
Embotics is a Canadian organisation. Started off in virtualisation management and moved to private cloud management and still keeps its bedrock of virtualisation. So anybody that has a virtualisation platform, a private cloud, or is thinking of private cloud, and has VMware and or Microsoft Hyper-V, we can sit in the middle and augment and show you how to save value in your existing and future estate.
So you provide the sort of tools to be able to do this, a management platform?
We do, absolutely. And one of the key strengths that we have, Canadians are very risk adverse. So our product is very simple to use, and it's download, install, and value within an hour.
Make your data center within an hour. Canadian, that's the thing. In an hour,
Canadians listen, perhaps Americans don't so much. But
oh, that's fighting talk. If we've got any Americans watching today, then please address all your comments to Colin. His email is at the end of this day. And good, that's great. And also accompanying Colin is from NVT, William McLeod. William, welcome to the studio.
Thank you. Absolutely delighted to be here today.
Now, I noticed that you are a Scottish person.
Yes.
Now, involved in saving money, I remember from when I was a kid, there was the advert where a guy said, "Many a mickle max a muckle," right?
Yeah.
I don't know what that means.
Nor do I.
Oh dear. Okay, so if anyone has got the internet on their computer, then maybe they could tell us and let us know. Dale, do you know what this means?
I don't actually, Tim. No.
This is Dale from, this is of course Dale from Freeform. Dale, welcome back to the studio.
Thanks, Tim.
Now, saving money comes up over and over and over again on the surveys, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. I mean, we've been... I look back, actually. The first virtualization research study we did with the Reg readers was about 6 years ago, actually. And the big theme then was save money through consolidation. It was, no one was doing it back then, really, or, they were just messing around.
They tell them to do it, then they all did it, they didn't save the money.
Big motivation, wasn't it?
Yeah, we're sorry. Now, before we go on, if you want to, provide the answer to the mickle and the macking a muckle question, which would be really helpful if you could. Also, more importantly, if you want to ask us questions today, then a little buttons above our heads will enable you to do so. You can also download the deck. There's some numbers on the deck which involve saving money and stuff like that you might want to get to, and also some useful links that you can get to. At the end of this, there is also a button to give us your feedback, tell us what you thought of what we did today, and we hope it's good, we hope it's useful for you. Let's get on with it. Okay, so looking at the first slide, William, this is from you. This is how you conceptualise the problem.
Yes, yeah. This is for a bit of background information. NVT are we're a managed services consultancy and service integration company. We're headquartered up in Scotland. We've had some meteoric success recently, not least of which winning the role of technology services integrator for the Commonwealth Games in 2014. And my job within the company is as a senior consultant in the pre-sales team, and I spend my day working with customers in two scenarios. The first one is solving challenges that they currently have, and the second one, and hopefully more often than not, is to work with customers to design solutions to avoid those challenges before they actually happen and impact the business. So there are always a number of hot topics that we're looking after. And I've put some of them on here. So, environments are getting more complex all the time. And that's, I think, partly due to virtualisation. And we sort of have these now tiers of technology, and if one of them falls down, we have major issues, and then we have services competing for resource and trying to make them work together better, getting more difficult. There's a big drive for new services as well. The business want to have IT do more. They don't want to give us any more money to do it, unfortunately. And there's a kind of a new kid on the block which has come about recently, which is this issue that IT departments have of trying to adopt cloud services, because some of them look very attractive, but trying to work out whether it's best for the business, whether you're allowed to do it, it's pretty difficult. So we're going to talk about how we can help make that decision today. But the one which comes up with most of the clients I work with and is bigger year on year was one that I'm terming massive data. And this was what was previously called big data. And I think it's got worse now, and when it hits its birthday next year, we're going to have to rename it with something like colossal data. And it's this idea that environments are just consuming so much resource now, so much storage, so much compute, so much memory, and it's doing so at a rate faster than what the technology is moving at. So, hard drives have sort of stagnated in size, partly due to the disasters and the tragedy in the Far East. And new networking technologies like 10 gig E is taking a long time to sort of come to fruition. Its adoption is a lot slower, which means that the cost of it isn't really coming down very quickly. And we can't keep up with the data growth because the technologies that are readily available at a reasonable cost are not available to us just yet. And one part that we're going to talk about today is this idea of VM sprawl. We see environments now that have huge amounts of VMs, and we don't really know what they do, and we don't really know what the cost is, and that's what we're going to work out today and how we can save money.
So our thing today, basically, we're looking at people, specifically people who have VMware, who virtualised using VMware, which is most people who've been doing virtualisation. Yeah. They've done that, they've got this sprawl's happened, and we're looking at how you recognise it, how you deal with it, how you reclaim it and optimise it.
Yeah, so we're probably aimed at people who have had virtualisation for maybe a couple of years or so, or longer. If you've had it longer, you probably ring a bell. What we're going to talk about today should really ring some bells with you.
You two guys work together on this, then? You're just sort of like a team for this?
No, we're a manufacturer of the software that's multifaceted, and William likes our software, NVT like our software, and it shows the value that it can address inside a customer's environment. Mm-hmm. So we're a catalyst to making customers the right choice on virtualization. And William saw the value, and NVT saw the value of our vCommander solution very early on.
Mm-hmm. I like the idea that you're the A-team. I'm going to stick...
Well, it sounds better than capitalist, doesn't it?
It does. It does. I'll stick with that. Well, good. Now, Dale, tell us a little bit about what reg readers who are involved in virtualization think.
Well, it's really just reiterating what we were just saying, actually. When we conduct studies with the reg readers, quite often we divide responses based on where people are in terms of level of adoption of a kind of technology. So what's really interesting is early adopters tend to face a whole set of different issues to people who are well into it. So what I've done here, because we're focused on those guys that have got more mature estates, is focused on the things that the reg readers are telling us who've got farther into virtualization. And top of the list, the top two are to do with cost and overhead. So top of the list is license costs, which is quite interesting, actually. It's not something that people necessarily thought about at the beginning of their virtualization.
I was about to say, when we were doing this 6 years ago,
didn't really come up.
No one's talked about the fact that the license costs would be in it, because we assumed that it all came for free.
Absolutely.
It's very difficult now when the license cost outweighs the cost of the physical server that it runs on. So people have to look at that as consideration.
Yeah. Yes. And the second thing is, just to reiterate what William was saying about virtual machine sprawl. I mean, it comes through in loudly and clearly. There is a third thing. Third on the list is just the way it changes the conversation you have with the business. Well, I think we'll pick up on this a little bit later on in terms of figuring out what requirements are and having the conversation about who pays for what and how, and if you're getting value for money in different decisions and so on. So those are the things that come out. I mean, the interesting question, if we move on to the next slide, is looking at how people have got to that stage. And as we've said, in the early days, if you start off on the left-hand side, people had a focus on cost savings. Some great benefits from rapid provisioning, lots of kind of pats on the back and stuff as a result of some of the early wins that they got from that. That gave them the confidence to scale up and start to get more into more critical workloads, for example. But as they started to introduce scalability as they started to get more into virtualization, they started to realize that there were some networking implications, some storage implications, and that's when the license cost issue starts to really come in as well, because you reach a certain point and you find, well, actually you need the next step up in terms of management tooling, as well as the basic cost of the infrastructure licenses. So a lot of people sort of went through that. They bit the bullet. They kind of got themselves through that pain. They maybe have upgraded some of their kit. They may have just invested and written big checks to VMware. And then that was fine. And then they it wasn't totally static, but then there was a period of time, usually, when you see people just carry on with the way they're going. The problem is that what we've seen is pretty much everyone reports that your environment just degrades over time. So you end up with sprawl, you end up with a lot of bloat, you end up with, generally speaking, I called it creeping waste here, which, but it's a kind of it sort of creeps up on you over time. You don't realise that you've got more and more fat in the installation as you go on. So we're actually coming across a lot of people now who say, well, yeah, we do realise that it's costing us a lot more than we anticipated. We do realise that it's not as slick as it was, but actually we don't necessarily any longer understand how the thing is put together. So actually moving on and saying, well, let's do the next stage of rebaselining, rationalisation, or whatever, is actually quite hard for them.
But that's why we're here.
Yeah,
that's why we're here today. So if you recognise this, you're suffering from sprawl and bloat, and you're surrounded by creeping waste, then this will work it out.
B-movie.
By the way, for anyone who's hanging on for this, let's get rid of this. Vince O'Hare, thank you very much for saying that many a mickle makes a muckle translates as many small amounts accumulate to make a large amount. So that's exactly online for this. That's good. And Vince, we ought to send you something. We'll work out some way to do that. We'll send you something sort of register-ish, reg-branded, and that will be good. William, tell us about this. Your graph here of this. This is basically the sprawl in a graph, isn't it?
Yeah. I've got a theory that I want to put to Colin and Dale here, and I want to know what you think of this statement. And it's that VMs have just become another form of unstructured data.
Absolutely.
Yep.
And I think that's what's happened. So when we introduced VMware or any form of virtualization a number of years ago, it just started to grow.
Yeah.
But the knowledge that we had of what was in that environment, so who owns that VM, what does it actually do, how important is it to the business, we didn't gather that information. So that's sort of a metadata on your virtualized environment. And what happened over time was that the amount of capacity that we consumed just started to grow. And what we see in the graph here, and this is one thing that I'll always argue, is that there's going to be a level of organic growth. So I think it's absolutely normal that you have more capacity consumed this year than you did last year, partly because there are more services that we provide. So if we go back 10 years ago, IT probably provided file and print services. There was a finance application, and if we look at it now, it can be many. It can be tens and 20s of desktop type applications that everyone in the organisation has. So this idea of organic growth is always going to happen. I think it's absolutely normal. But we've actually realised a growth which is quite far beyond that. And there are a couple of reasons why we've had that. One of them is that the workloads that we've provisioned have ended up with more capacity than require. So by far,
it would be too generous.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we're not being frugal because it's easy to click the button.
Well, you don't want to. You don't want to make the other mistake and not giving them enough.
No, what you could do is you could start off with giving them what you think is right, and if they need more, you can provision more, because that's just a click of a button. So if it's not running quite quick enough, we can give it more RAM or we can give it more CPU. That's, I'd argue, almost just as easy as clicking the button to start with to over-provision a VM.
Yeah, that's fair.
But if that workload maybe next month doesn't require as much resource, we never tune it back, and we end up with VMs that are no longer used in the environment. I'm sure people will agree that they've probably got these, but they don't know where they are.
So the zombie VMs.
Yeah, this creeping waste.
Yeah.
So I think that probably exists in most virtualised environments, certainly any that have been around for any length of time.
Yeah.
But there's sort of a hope here, because that capacity that we've provisioned, which we're kind of hypothetically we don't think we need, we could call it recoverable capacity and maybe implement tools that would identify it and give us it back. And that would effectively then save us money if there are any organisations out there who are trying to get approval to buy new servers or buy more licensing. We could probably just recover what you're wasting.
This is the point where I'm going to say, so what are those tools? No, which is what we get, which is basically the rest of what we're doing today is look at these tools. Yeah,
so there are a couple of things that I want to cover today. One's the tool set that we would use to work this out and move from being passively managed virtualization infrastructure to an actively managed one where we don't have all this waste. But it's also more of a strategy as to how we provision infrastructure for these services to run on that doesn't cost as much as what
it's never as simple, is it, Dale, as just sort of running a tool and saying, there we are, that solved the problem.
No, there's the initial job of actually identifying where the waste is and taking that waste out. But then once you've done that, if you don't actually change the way you do things, it's just going to come back again over the course of time, isn't it?
Okay. Let's look at that now. We have on your next slide here, and this is kind of the ad hoc way in which a lot of companies you say that you deal with are dealing with this problem.
Yeah, so what tends to happen is we run out of capacity and we go and buy more hardware. But if that hardware is a year newer than what we put in to start with, it's going to be considerably more powerful. So we sort of see this seesaw effect where we need more hosts, but then when we actually do a sort of reconsolidation, we do it on bigger hardware. So it sort of becomes the same amount as what you had when you did virtualization in the first place. And it seems to be sort of masking this issue. We've got this rapid growth in capacity requirements, but because we put in new hardware every year that's more powerful than what we did the year before, the number of servers that we have just seems to stay approximately the same.
So what you say is this is not, to be clear, this is not solving the problem. You can have this dead weight loss that we had in the middle of the graph there, and you can also have this going on at the same time. It looks good, but it's not solving our problem.
No, not at all. I mean, if you look at the servers that you purchased 5 years ago compared to one that you might go and acquisition today, it's an awful lot more powerful. So when we went from 50 physical servers down to 5 virtualized hosts, why has it not went down to 2 after 5 years? And it's because we have this sort of a runaway requirement for capacity, and a lot is just wasted capacity. So it's masking an issue, I think. Organisations probably have approximately the same number of servers they had 5 years ago when they did virtualization to what they have today, and it's due to this sort of ongoing reconsolidation and bigger hardware all the time.
Colin, is this what you see as well, this reconsolidation problem that people are managing to constrain everything within their data centre?
We're seeing it constantly, and back to that, I picked that up from what Dale said, is that people can look at tools to identify some of their pain in there. But if they don't then wrap a policy around that in the future, in 6 months' time or 12 months' time, they'll be exactly the same situation. So they need to look at something that augments their estate, looks at what they're doing, looks at what should be positioned in a different, maybe even different hypervisor, maybe even on HyperV, and then wrap a policy around that. Yes. There is a perception in lots of customers for the people requesting that the virtual machines that a VM is free. Virtualization is free. I'll request 8 CPUs because I can have 8 CPUs. And it's not. It has an impact and a cost to somebody in the business. And we're seeing this now catching up, and lots of customers are looking and going, we need to do things a different way. So there is a realisation, a sea change, that virtualization is not free, thankfully, and we need to wrap policy and automation around some of these structures.
So one of the very first things for the IT department, because the message that came out from virtualization at the beginning, the IT department wanting to provide service was to say, if you want to request a virtual machine, go ahead, request it from us, because we found all this. Virtualization has given us the ability to give you one without having to, order it from a manufacturer. So that's great. And now we have to first thing is we have to row back on this to say it's not as simple as you just saying, I want one.
It's absolutely not as simple. I know one customer, I won't name them, very, very large global company, and they found 1,100 virtual machines that were unused. Now, we stepped back 5 years ago, and if you look to find 1,100 physical machines, that's a data center of enormous capacity. So they need to look at what they're doing in virtualization. It brought us a lot of saviour points in terms of virtualization, the portability, disaster recovery, affordable for all. But some of it's become like a jailer. They're down this path of virtualization. As William said, the tools they have to bring in to manage other parts, that they just add more and more hosts, more and more licenses, more and more storage. That's the easy way, but it has a cost impact. And I think what we're going to show is the impact of that cost inside their business and how they can recover that within their own existing business. And it's not difficult. It really is not hard.
Well, let's get on and do it then, I suppose. That's the thing. Now, the first thing for this, William, is you're saying what we need to do is to apply some rules before virtualizing.
Yeah, well, that's the point I was making was that we used to apply these rules. Before we did virtualization, we had a sort of a logical rule set that said, when we want to provision a new service, let's work out how available it has to be, how much performance it needs to have, how relatively how important is it to the business, how much money should we spend on providing this service. But we don't do that now. Ever since we virtualised our environments, when the business say, we want IT to provide this new service, we click a button now and it just appears on our virtualised infrastructure. And the workload, regardless of how important it is or how relatively important it is to the business, lives on the same tin and the same storage and crosses the same network.
Well, one of the reasons we did that was for, I say we as if I'd actually ever done it, one of the reasons we did that was for simplicity.
Yeah.
And at the beginning of the virtualization story, the management tools were not so good about it. So stick everything in a single environment, and that's the quickest way out of it, isn't it?
Yeah.
You're saying there's no excuse for that now?
I don't think so. I think what we should be doing is, because the costs have now spiralled and we've realised that most organisations have realised that it's not sustainable, because we have to do more for less every year, and the public sector especially are feeling this. They're having their IT budgets cut all the time. If you have 100 services to provision and there are only a few of them which are very important, should we have them on a tier 1 storage system? Should they be on your most powerful servers? And should they be crossing your fastest networks? I don't think so. I think that the best approach would be to have a tiered system where we can have very expensive equipment, very capable equipment, and very capable support and recovery capabilities for the most important things, and provision hardware and licensing and software and all the management tools which cost less for the workloads which have a lower relative importance to the organisation.
So before we get into typifying what a tier 1 and a tier 2 is, so Dale, on this, is the assumption then that you have to earn tier 1, that you're on the bottom tier unless you can prove that you should be on the top one?
Yeah, I mean, just to sort of put it a slightly different way to how William's just been describing it, I think we've just lost some discipline in the whole process of saying we can rapidly provision new services. That set expectations within the business. The whole life cycle of rolling something out has gone from weeks to hours. Against the life cycle of weeks, actually sitting down and organising a conversation around how important this is to the business, what are the resilience requirements, and so on. And we had to do that anyway because we needed to spec the kit that we were going to go and raise a purchase rec for. But that doesn't happen anymore, and I think we've just kind of lost it. So by default, I think what people have done, because they hadn't really planned where they've ended up, and I think it's fair to say a lot of people have ended up doing a lot more with virtualization than they envisaged in the early days. We talked about some of the conversations we had here. They've ended up just sticking everything on tier 1 by default. We have come across some some sites that have actually gone the opposite way around, and they've seen some great benefits. They, throw things on tier 2 to begin with, and wait and see what happens on the basis.
If anything breaks,
and literally, I mean, the prerequisite for that is actually monitoring and management, so making sure that you have visibility and you can
not just saying do that, but it is a possible way of going.
Yeah, but that's not what most people do. Most people go tier 1 by default, and that's where we end up with these runaway costs that we've been discussing.
Let's have a look at what's on tier 1, William. This is what you put together for the attributes of tier 1.
Yeah, so it could cover a lot of different capabilities for what you could do, and I've provided this as an example. So the next slide that we have is a sort of a hypothetical tier 2, but for tier 1. We might say, well, we have VMware with fault tolerant capability. We have storage that might even be up to 6 nines of uptime, which is obviously very expensive. We might have frequent snapshots, synchronous replication to a nearby data centre, and then asynchronous replication to Timbuktu or somewhere. What would you want to store on that? Well, you'd want to just take the sort of crown jewels, the workloads which are absolutely required to make the business operate, we would want to put on tier 1.
Give me an idea, guys, both of you. When you go out into the field, how much stuff do you see of the applications that your customers are running that you think that's a genuine tier 1?
Well, we do a sort of a workshop where we sit down with the business, and if you can get a sort of a vertical slice of an organisation in the room, and by that I mean someone that knows where the organisation's going, someone who knows how to run it day in, day out, and probably quite importantly, the guy that knows what effect, what cost it has in the business if the IT systems fail. If you can sort of get them in a room to say, well, this is what the IT department provisions for the organisation to use, what's most important, where would you sort of place these? And it could even be taking magnetic stickers on a whiteboard to say, these are the most important. These ones we sort of a need, but they're less important than those. And you know what? These ones, if we had to live without them for a day or two, we wouldn't be limping along. And you can get some quite surprising results from that. There was one we did a couple of years ago where we sat down with the IT department first of all and mapped out what we do for the organisation. And they had 87 different services. And when we asked the business, they said, OK, well, out of those 87, there are 5 of them that are more important than the others, but within that 5, there's one which we really need to have all the time. So we had taken an IT infrastructure that had 87 services running on it and identified one very important one.
So I mean, that's an extreme example. What I can see is you're going to get quite a lot of pushback from if you're dealing with the business, because departments own applications, and for them this is the most important thing in the world.
I think that's why the composition of these workshops that what was mentioned is so important. You need to have people in there that have the authority and can have a bit of a broader view
to look across of the department.
They also need to understand perhaps the SLA if they have within their existing business, to say, if I'm going to deploy this on a tier 2 hypervisor, this is the cost to the business. If I'm going to put it on tier 1, in this case potentially VMware, this is the cost to the business. At the moment, they have no visualization of any of the costs and how much it costs to run a virtual estate. Because it's all on tier 1 and it's all
free. Yeah,
it's all virtualization is free.
I mean, in my experience, you can move up quite rapidly actually to an appreciation of what is and isn't important. I mean, if you're a logistics company, you're sending out frozen foods, then your warehousing system and your logistics management is going to be business critical, and if it goes down, stuff's going to perish. I mean, that's a pretty easy one. Your ERP system may or may not be business critical, depending on the nature of your business.
Why would it not be?
Well, if you're the kind of organisation that's just using SAP, say, predominantly for basic accounting, if that's down for an hour or two, that's not the end of the world. If you're using it to manage your production line, that's actually a totally different kettle of fish. So, I mean, the ones we come across quite often, or most commonly, externally facing websites, call centre management systems, it's these kind of things where you've got continuous processes where the business stops or stumbles if they're interrupted, and those sorts of things. People are now, interestingly, they never envisaged putting those on virtualized environments, but they are now, and therefore, they become very critical to look after.
Now, I have put the Tier 2 tiered infrastructure slide up here because I notice, looking in the top left-hand corner, you see Windows Server 2012 as the what you're using instead of VMware as Tier 2. It's a Tier 2 virtualization environment.
Just to be very clear on it, HyperV is an enterprise-ready product now.
Yeah.
And more organisations are thinking about it, and quite rightly, because it costs a lot less money. But this is to do with an approach. So we're not saying take your VMware and keep it as for Tier 1 applications and implement HyperV as Tier 2. Most organisations have a virtualised infrastructure which is based on VMware. There are definitely savings that can be made by introducing HyperV, but you probably don't have the skill set to be able to take out your VMware and bin the licensing that you have and implement HyperV. But you want to look at it, and this is more of an approach. So it's what we generally do with a customer who is looking at HyperV and is very serious about it, is we would introduce it for some services to begin with. No one's ever going to go, big bang and change hypervisor in a weekend. That's not going to happen. So this is more an approach. My take on it is that HyperV is enterprise ready. We have customers using it for production systems, and it's been very successful, but they still have a blend of HyperV and VMware.
But a reason to think about it in the first place is based on a cost comparison, a license cost comparison.
Yes, yeah. So if you're licensed for Windows Server 2012 already, and a lot of people are listening today will be running a lot of their business and a lot of their services on Windows Server, then you're licensed to run HyperV. So why not take advantage of it? That's the point that we're making, and this is what they're
introduce it in an orderly way. If you're dipping your toe, you do that at Tier 2. We're going to get into a little bit more structure around that anyway, but that's why we're making this distinction here.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's a tactic. It's like when people first took virtualization on board with VMware. Typically, they didn't start out with critical applications. They started out with testing dev and then less critical ones and move forward from there. Ultimately, they built confidence. So you need to build confidence in your Hyper-V environment, I think is what you're saying, before you start moving up into Tier 1. It's not that it's not capable of Tier 1.
We have a customer who did this about a year ago now, and they introduced a couple of hosts with Hyper-V on them, and their Hyper-V environment has now grown to be physically larger than their VMware environment. And the applications that they run on it, they're sort of choosing Hyper-V by default, and if they have an important service, they have a discussion with the business. But if they just have a request that comes from one of the departments in the business to say, I need 16 new VMs and they need to have this specification, they're now just provisioning it on Hyper-V. They're not necessarily letting the business department know that they're on a different hypervisor to what their other workloads are running on. But no one's actually coming back to say, you provision me these new servers and they're running slower than the other ones that you've given us.
Now, Colin, I have some doubts about this, and the first one is basically you've got two hypervisors.
Yes.
So there's a hidden cost in terms of two sets of skills and two sets of management, perhaps. The other thing is provisioning becomes more complicated, because instead of just pressing a single button to provision, you're pressing lots of buttons.
It can, and that's coming back to Dale's comment. So you need to choose the right tools for the right solution. So, for instance, and this isn't a sales pitch by any imagination, but we have a technology called vCommander that can sit in the middle. It needs one Windows virtual machine. It's installed in less than an hour, up, running, pointed at vCenter and pointed at Hyper-V. So the problem for a customer is that he thinks it's going to be cheaper running on... Sorry, my microphone's caught around my foot. Apologies. He thinks it's going to be cheaper running on Hyper-V, and invariably it's going to be the case. But how do you justify and present that cost as a tangible?
Yeah.
You go onto YouTube and you see VMware saying it's cheaper, you say Microsoft saying it's cheaper. So then the reticence, I don't want to bring two hypervisors in because it's complex. Do I want VMware managing my Microsoft estate? Do I want vice versa managing the other way? Perhaps not. So if there's tools like ourselves and other organizations that sit in the middle that make it very, very simple, perhaps I'm going to request a VM, and as William says, the user doesn't know where that VM should be. But, for instance, I can justify that workload sitting on a different hypervisor based upon an economic cost. Look at the cost center. Does that user have that cost in his cost center? Does he have the skills? Build that as metadata, and straight away, within half an hour, that machine is provisioned on the right hypervisor for that individual user, with no complexity shown to him as a user. So there are tools, and the most important thing is then to wrap a policy around that. If we keep going on and just the same process, then we'll be in the same situation in 6 months' time. We'll have Sprawl on HyperV scenario and Sprawl on a VMware scenario. So get them under control, look at HyperV, look at the costs on that environment, and then wrap policy around both. Because as William says, no one's going to move overnight on a weekend from a VMware platform that they've tried, tested, they're happy with, to a HyperV platform overnight. Mm-hmm. But they're under pressure from finance to look at alternative solutions. If I remember when a lot of our organizations virtualized 3 or 4 years ago, everybody understood the value. Finance understood the value of IT. They could say, I'm going from 100 servers down to 10. There's 90 warranties gone. They understood that value straight away. And they saw, we're going to save this amount of money. Now we're 3 years down the line. And I can pretty much guarantee that anybody that's been using VMware for more than 6 months, we can save that customer money within an hour. So anybody that doesn't have an hour to look at saving themselves money, we've got an hour today. Perhaps they're going to go away in a lunch hour, download a product and have a look and go, I quite like Hyper-V. It will suit my solution in my business.
This is good. We're going to come up to this in the end. We're leading up to this, haven't we? Really, is how you can save their money. But the point that we really have to make here is this is something. Managing this is something that goes on all the time now. It's not. You don't do a cost benefit once and then take off from there.
Yes, absolutely. Because when everybody virtualized, or majority, they ran Capacity Planner or Platespin or tools of that nature to say, that's what I'm going to take from a physical platform, that's what I'm going to take to a virtual platform. Mm-hmm. And we see lots of customers that haven't done anything else since they virtualized. So the 3 years down the line, there's been no health checks, there's been no audits, there's been no check and balances on, are we still doing it right? So the sprawl, the drift, the bloat, it's not difficult to get rid of. It's very, very easy.
Can I just say, a lot of people, even though sometimes I don't necessarily admit it, did migrate a lot of crap across to their virtualized environment.
So it became virtual?
Yeah, it just became virtual crap. So, then they didn't even sort it out back then in many situations. So,
and it's important as well, and you made the point, if we're talking about VMs being a form of unstructured data, actually gathering the metadata on it, so you find out what it is, what it does, who owns it, what cost centre does it lie under for the business. Mm-hmm. It's important to get that information, and that's not necessarily an easy thing to do. If you have an environment with 1,000 VMs in it, it can take you a long time to sit down and go through the business and
manually. If you did it, it would
right at the beginning.
Ending.
Right at the beginning, that third item on the list. After we got to license costs and sprawl, and then we got on to.
I was going to ask you about that, and it completely went out.
It's
of my
really
head,
about it's about governance. It's about knowing what you have, knowing who owns it, who pays for it, how it gets paid for, what's the cost of it, and so on. And that's really, there's a bucket of stuff that comes under that third thing. So, people out there are obviously feeling that sort of pain and feeling that exposure, I think, because they don't have the kind of visibility.
If your mess is built up a little bit now, you've got a couple of thousand virtual machines, and you're not exactly sure where they are and who owns them. You can do a discovery and you can find out that they're there. Mm-hmm. But that's kind of like a stage one, because then you have to pin them down to someone or other, work out whether they are needed, whether they are whether they are cost justified. That's quite a lot of work, isn't it?
Some people haven't necessarily been that disciplined about segmenting test and dev from production as well, so you end up with all kinds of versions of the same VMs that have just accumulated over time.
We see various versions of different ESX platforms in certain states, quite common. So I take your point, yes, they will have to look at that, and there will be some manual effort to optimise that estate. There's some tools that can automate that process, but you really want the checks and balances in place and a policy-driven automation strategy moving forward. It sounds very grandiose, but it is really very, very simple. There's no myth about this technology. It's just there are certain tools out there that take the complexity away.
Well, let's have a look at your tool for doing this, because this is what we've got coming up, isn't it? There we go.
So it's very difficult. If I'm in finance and I have a renewal drop on my desk to say, here's my VMware renewal. Now, we know there's a lot of optimization opportunities there that it shouldn't be running like that. But instead of, we see a point where the finance are going, this is very expensive for us to run. I have a campus agreement, I have a select agreement, I have an EA, or I have Microsoft traditional licenses. I've heard Hyper-V is good. Should we be looking at that? But and then it gets passed to the guys, the admins, people in IT, to say, okay, justify to me the cost of Hyper-V versus VMware. How do they do it without introducing Hyper-V into their current estate? It's very easy to go on YouTube and you look at the battles and VMware saying their model's cheaper. And you go there and then it's Microsoft and say that. But that doesn't help that customer make that decision. No. They can only justify the cost on their own estate. So that's where we come in. In reality is that we can health check a solution. So they go to the website, they download a product for 30 days. They don't need 30 days, they need a couple of hours. So they download that onto one Windows virtual machine. So they put that onto one Windows virtual machine pointed at vCenter. And how much data do you want to import from vCenter? If I'm running for 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, 3 months, 2 months? But then we import that data. Then here's the real tangible part. We don't put the costs in. Microsoft don't put the costs in. VMware don't put the costs in. The customer puts his own costs into the variable.
So what sort of variable costs?
OS costs, licensing costs, memory costs, gigabyte, tier 1 storage.
Make a list of this before you start running the thing. And
yes.
Yeah.
So, but then we get the thrown back at us, say, I don't know the cost. Well, somebody in the business does, because somebody's writing the checks when you're requesting 8 CPUs for a virtual machine and you don't need that and it has an impact to the business somewhere. Somebody has those costs. So that, as we see, is a difficult point of putting in the real tangible costs. Once those costs are put in, then you can see exactly which workload is cheaper to run on a hypervisor, whether that's VMware or whether that's Microsoft. We find 95% of that when it runs, it is cheaper to run on a Microsoft platform. The others have a special agreement with VMware, or they have a well-optimized estate.
But to be clear, you've already modelled it, so a lot of it is about dropping. You're filling in the blanks, I guess. Is that a fair?
We're filling in the blanks. Those models are in there. We're putting the process in of lifecycle management, automation, workflow. So, for instance, customer can request a virtual machine from IT, and we can look at that and say, here's the service catalog. Now, here's a virtual machine running on VMware that costs £4,000. Here's a virtual machine running on Hyper-V that costs £2,000. And you've already given the SLA to the business that they are identical. So we build metrics into the back end and the metadata to say, OK, let me look at some factors. Perhaps let me go to the cost center to see if they have a cost center, see if they have budget for the cost center for the VMware one. No, they don't. OK, he's getting a Hyper-V model. Are they going to have deliverables? Do they want it backed up? So the user requests his service from the portal himself. So I want synchronous replication. Well, guess what? It has an impact to the business. It has a cost. So we're showing those costs to the person requesting the virtual machine, and then the ability of which virtual machine do you want, VMware or Microsoft? Or do we just default them to Microsoft because we've seen the costs now that are 50% of the VMware side? Do we just push that virtual machine straight out to that user?
So you can also do, it's the technical for it, fiddle around with it to say, well, we've got this much budget, what's the best way we can allocate it?
Yes.
The 8 services.
There's a slide further on. So we could look at a workload placement, for instance, to say, I have this particular virtual machine, and you have an SLA that you built inside your business, and I need this delivered. So you put some metrics in there to say, on this occasion, for what you're trying to achieve, it is better to run economically on potentially a Hyper-V environment. Or we can build the economics onto the estate to say if the customer is, and we do see Hyper-V coming into a test and dev environment, very much like VMware came in 4 years ago, and we are seeing them running in parallel inside an organization. So we can sit in the middle and spur off to both. But the ability to look at that individual workload, that virtual machine, and make a justification at some point that maybe that's a Monday, maybe it's a Tuesday, that now it is cheaper for that virtual machine to run on a different hypervisor. So we can then look to migrate that machine from one hypervisor to another. None of this is complex. As I said, the Canadians are risk adverse. They've made everything very, very simple to use. I can just about use it, so it is very, very simple. But it's giving IT the ammunition, all the information, the data to make an informed choice, to say, I am now going to go to a different hypervisor because I've got the tools. I can keep both hypervisors running, and I can keep the solution running and up, and I can migrate, I'd say tier one machines across to Hyper-V.
Can I just do a checkpoint here, because I think we're sort of turning this into a Hyper-V versus VMware thing, or it might come across that way. You could do pretty much everything you just said in a pure VMware environment and have a tier 1, tier 2 VMware environment. Is that true?
Yeah. Absolutely. And that's where we've come from, in that initial aspect of looking at a current VMware estate and optimizing that environment and say, look, I'm going to find you X amount of redundancy. I'm going to find these VMs have been powered off for 2 years, or machines that have no metadata, or open snapshots, just the traditional growth that we've seen. We were challenged in Sweden actually about 4 months ago. We sat in a large SI who said, you've got an hour. But we've just built this estate 2 weeks ago, so we know there's no bloat, there's nothing. We found recoverable costs about £20,000. And they sat and pointed at each other and said, well, where did those snapshots come from? I didn't do it. I ran a demo yesterday. So all that type of... We've got to be careful how we present it to the right people.
I was going to say, yes, you went in, you caused trouble. You were invited to cause trouble, you caused trouble. They go out.
And they optimised their environment. Yeah. But the value that virtualization brought us as a paradigm shift also brought pain. There's no two ways about that, in terms of it is very, very easy to create a virtual machine. So, in instance, how many of the people listening today find people come rushing and say, I need a virtual machine, I need it this afternoon, I need it for this topic? Do they come running in 3 months' time with the same urgency to say, decommission that machine? No, they don't. So, by natural default, the wastage and wastage grows. So we're just saying, whether it's our tools or anything, wrap a policy around what you're trying to achieve in virtualization. You can control it. It can give back everything that we thought 3 years ago. But in essence, we see a lot of people have opened Pandora's box inside their organization. It's difficult to put everything back in.
So there's a sort of educational element to this as well, because the wider business, the people that are requesting these VMs don't understand. It's not their fault that they don't understand that there's a cost associated with it. So actually teaching them again that, well, if you want that, there's a cost here. And one of the things that I really like is being able to do a sort of a showback model to say to the business, well, these are what the departments are using, this is what they're using them on, because normally what's going to happen is the finance department are going to look at it and say, well, we use what in IT, that's quite expensive, how can we reduce that? And it's easy then to take it to them and say, well, if we take these services and we move them onto tier 2 storage, and there's loads of different options now, so if you want to put a storage system in that is almost 5 nines available, there's a huge array of what you can choose, and they cost a lot less than,
So it wraps back to some of the objections I was making at the beginning, to say politically this is very hard to do when you're going to the business and say you can't have the thing that you thought you could have anymore. And is this a fight that you want to pick? And you're saying is, if you can show at this level of detail, this is the resource you're using, and this is how much it costs the business.
And we can also hypothetically say, well, this is what you have just now. We think it will probably work if we move it around and make it look like that, and it's going to cost you an awful lot less. And you're sort of taking a business argument to the business then, and that's a lot easier to do than take a technological argument to them.
Dale, tell us about the Reg readership and how they cope with this, because when we have your colleague Tony here, he's very, very fond of Chargeback and saying that charging on a department level for what the resources that are provided is a great way to go, whilst acknowledging the difficulty of it. And we've got this showback, which is kind of like that, but not issuing invoices.
Chargeback without enforcement, I think would be.
Yeah. It's nice chargeback. And are the Reg readers doing this?
We've seen a real definite change in attitudes around this. If you go back about 4 years ago even, but certainly farther than that, generally speaking, most people, particularly people who've been around in the industry for a little while, have been burned at least once in their career by a chargeback mechanism that just got out of control and created all kinds of problems. So there was a lot of negative feeling about 4 years ago, and what we've seen between then and now is people actually going through the process of having broken down the old ways of accounting for stuff. the old procurement cycle that we talked about earlier on no longer exists. So you don't have assets that are now allocated to cost centres and are depreciated against cost centres anymore. These assets are shared assets. And the more people have gotten to virtualised environment. So the interesting thing then is, well, how do you actually allocate that? Because that asset may today be doing one thing, but actually next week might be doing something else.
I think what's happened, though, is that the traditional model of buying physical servers was sort of easy for everyone to understand, because when you needed something, you paid for it. But with virtualisation, we've sort of just changed the way that we spend money. Mm-hmm. And IT run out of resource, and they have to go to finance and say, can I have more money? Rather than the business department that wants a new server.
So they become IT assets, not business unit assets, in sort of physical or accounting terms.
Yes.
Therefore, it's become doubly important for IT to be able to explain where those costs are going, or what those costs are being allocated to. Mm-hmm. So, hence, Showback is... That's where most people are at the moment, Showback. We're still picking up a little bit of resistance to Chargeback, but...
I think Showback's sort of a conflict-free version of Chargeback.
It is, yeah.
And in my experience, it tends to be more useful to introduce Showback into an organisation, because I think Chargeback is a bit more of a sort of us and them.
And from my old, SAP days, I just remember sitting in workshops when we were talking about budget allocations and that kind of accounting stuff. People still work on an allocation basis when it comes to cost. Every year or every period, they'll make an assumption as to, based on whatever parameters, how much this department is consuming versus that one. But then they're not doing it on a real-time consumption basis. They'll then revisit it end of next quarter or end of next year or whatever it happens to be. Showback at least gives you the opportunity to feed sensible allocation numbers into that kind of periodic budgeting process.
Right. Now, we've got that. So we're right down here at sort of like from the single virtual machine level where you can make a cost benefit, but you can go up to the, you go right up to the generic, the whole data center environment. So you can move between the two. You've got here, this is something that you did, isn't it, Colin?
It is, yes. Yeah. And this is atypical of most of our customers. This one isn't as big a saver as most of our customers. And remember, this can all be done in a few hours. It's not.
How long did this take, this?
This took for them to realise this. They looked at it, they downloaded, they tested, they looked, evaluated, and then they optimised. So the optimisation took them a few days to do. Mm-hmm. But reality, just to give this, university customer, 650 virtual machines, and looked at the sprawl. A reality, they costed out each VM. That was the tough part. How much does each VM cost us? Because they didn't know what it cost. What's our storage? What's our storage allocation to each individual virtual machine? So that's the scrambling around trying to understand what costs are in an environment. But straight away, the day one savings that they were able to identify was nearly $300,000. So I apologise, it's in dollars, and about £200,000. But straight away, they decommissioned 100 virtual machines that have been left turned off for over a year. Open snapshots, all this type of environment. They were looking at HyperV, but they had no budget to go out and buy new hosts to bring in HyperV to run alongside VMware with a view to move across to HyperV. So what we found straight away and what they were able to do is free up 4 hosts. So those 4 hosts are freed up. There's their budget now to allocate onto HyperV. At a campus agreements, there was no additional costs, so the HyperV environment now cozily runs alongside VMware. And just as William said, the HyperV environment in this case is again growing, and the VMware is moving downwards because of the cost in their estate. But it reduced a big significant cost of their VMware licensing renewal costs as well, that are not inconsequential in any business. In some cases it can be up to $2,000 per socket inside a business. So they were able to sit, like most of our customers now, go, I like the idea of Hyper-V, I don't know how much it costs, can you justify how much it costs? So they're able to look at this, download, install, review the current VMware estate, optimize that, free up the hardware, bring Hyper-V into there, and now run with vCommander in the middle, cozily monitoring, managing both sides, and moving virtual machines based upon a cost. So that's a big, big saving. So I challenge anybody to say, don't go to lunch, download vCommander, put it onto a virtual machine, and see how much money you can save in your own. Don't listen to us, Microsoft or VMware.
Don't go to lunch.
Just download. I'll buy you lunch if you save some money.
You don't get a lunch anyway. We know about this, yeah.
Can I just ask a question of you guys, actually? Because when we talk to people who have serious Hyper-V installations, they've also spent money on System Center. And can you just comment on the System Center component and how that plays with your tooling and the kind of costs associated with that?
System Center is very, very key. We plug into components of System Center, so we're not a replacement for System Center in any way, shape, or form. However, what we find in really large estates, if they're at VMware to start with and they're moving to HyperV and System Center, we're not seeing those users say, I'm going to decommission all my skills in VMware and suddenly bring them all up on System Center, because the initial cost of that is cost prohibitive, because they've got too high level of educated parts of the organization. So we're a stepping stone. So we sit in the middle, we introduce System Center Virtual Machine Manager, and as the more dependence on Hyper-V comes up, the more that System Center comes up. But it gains the customer time. He doesn't have to do everything all in one go, of move one to the other. They do it over a period of 18 months to 2 years. So as and when that hypervisor grows on a Microsoft platform, so does the System Center skills. So that ability to put the skills in as and when they're needed, not all up front.
So if you make savings by going in that direction, you can invest out of the savings?
Absolutely. You can very, very easily.
Yes, if that's the way you want to go. Just in the last few minutes, we made it through to about 3 minutes before the end, William, without mentioning the cloud, but I noticed that you've put it in here. What do you want to say about that?
Well, I didn't think it would be an IT show if we could
it's not
talk about
really,
the cloud.
is it? No. Yeah.
So there's a struggle just now within organisations that are looking at the cloud to actually work out whether or not it's going to cost more or less money to move any of your services into a cloud-based platform. If you want to consume services on the cloud, it's generally very predictable cost-wise. So we can, if you want to move your email into a cloud-based platform, we can say to finance it's going to cost us this much every month, and that's it's going to be very predictable for the next year. And if finance come back and say, okay, well, what will it cost us to host it or continue to host it ourselves? IT at the minute sort of just shrug their shoulders and say, we don't know, we can't tell. But what we can do with the tool set is to actually analyse that, and if we gather up everything that it takes to provision email on premise, and that can be hardware, virtualisation, licensing, support, and then the capabilities to meet the SLA that's required, we can calculate that out to say, well, this is what it's going to cost us to provide it on premise, and that includes all of the costs, including the management of it and the support of it, and training our company to be able to look after it, and then properly compare it to what the cloud costs.
And as you're saying, are you saying then this might make cloud less of an... If you were optimising internally, cloud might not be the best option from a cost basis?
No, I mean, there are obviously going to be wider arguments, technically, so we have to work out, is it going to work, and legally we have to work out whether or not we're allowed to put it there. This is the financial part of the argument, so that we can say, well, this is what it costs us, this is what it would cost us to move it. And it doesn't cover the technical side of it, whether it would work, whether we can do it, but at least we'll know then.
You're on firm ground when you know how much you're spending for it. Do you think that will work, Dale?
Yeah, it's critical actually, because historically, we worked on the cost of running assets when it comes to our own internal IT infrastructure. Cloud, by definition, is about the cost of delivering a service, and in many ways, whether you're a cloud advocate or not, it is actually challenging, I think, all of us in IT to get a little bit smarter about taking more of a service sort of mindset when we're talking about costs and benefits.
All right, so finally wrap us up, Colin, on this. I'll put this slide up here. Now, the guys have been very brave on this, and you've put up there your Twitter handles and your email addresses and everything like that, so they can get in touch. And there's your download as well. If someone's going to download go away now, download and have a go at it this afternoon. Sort of information that you need, just very quickly, the sort of information that you're going to need to make this make sense, to go around and collect that now.
So what you're going to need as the customer is one Windows virtual machine. And we've just said there's plenty of those out there. You're way too many at the moment. And that's it. Download the product, full function in 30 days. You will get the value within a couple of hours. Download, point to vCenter, show how much value you've got in your environment. Technically, it's not hard to do.
And the information about the cost of the environment that they need to collect. Yeah,
they'll need to know their OS cost, their price per gig, but they may say, okay, my price per gig in my environment, tier 1 storage, I may have some replication. So, put some thoughts into not just the spinning disk price, but the replication price onto there. And our hashtags are there, our email addresses are there, so just send through if you're stuck on anything. We don't think you will be, apart from the costs, but that may be a trip into finance to say, how much are we paying for this stuff? How much is this license costing us? Break it down, amortise it down across the estate.
It's a slightly nicer trip than a usual one into finance because you're not asking for more.
No, you go in and say, hey, we'd like to save some money.
You might save some money. Well, that's a good thing. Let us know how you get on with that, guys, if you go through with that. I'd be quite interested. You'd be interested.
Yeah, definitely.
You take the stats team down at Freeform onto that.
Yeah.
To work out whether these saving, how much you're going to save and where it comes from and what you decide to do. Please do let us know about that. We'd always be happy to hear it. We're out of time today. Let us know what you thought of this Regcast, and please download the deck as well, so you can see some of the savings and the references. And please join us again for the next Regcast as well. And so we will see you soon. But meanwhile, from the guys here and from me, Tim Phillips, goodbye.